The American tank destroyer crew had been tracking the German Panther for nearly 20 minutes through the dense Ardennes forest when their commander made a decision that would have gotten him court-martialed 6 months earlier. Instead of engaging with their own 3-inch gun, he ordered his crew to abandon their M10 Wolverine and sprint 200 yards through sniper-infested woods to reach an abandoned German 88mm Flak gun they had passed earlier that morning. The Panther's frontal armor could shrug off their American gun at anything beyond point-blank range. But that German 88? That could punch through a Panther's glacis plate at 1,000 yards like it was tissue paper. What happened next, in those first weeks of 1945, would force Allied commanders to confront an uncomfortable truth about their own equipment and spark one of the most unusual tactical innovations of the entire Western European campaign. Sometimes the weapons you capture from your enemy work better than the ones your own country gave you. The winter of 1944 to 1945 marked a turning point in how Allied forces viewed captured German equipment. For years, captured enemy weapons had been treated primarily as intelligence opportunities or war trophies. German rifles, machine guns, and vehicles were catalogued, photographed, studied, and then typically destroyed or sent to rear area depots for technical evaluation. The idea of actually employing captured heavy weapons in frontline combat operations was considered irregular, potentially dangerous, and logistically impractical. After all, captured German ammunition would eventually run out, spare parts were non-existent, and friendly fire incidents seemed inevitable if Allied soldiers started using weapons that sounded and looked German. But the German counteroffensive in the Ardennes, which began on December 16, 1944, changed these calculations dramatically. The offensive, later known as the Battle of the Bulge, saw German forces deploy their most formidable armoured vehicles in concentrated numbers. Panther tanks, which had already proven difficult for Allied armour to engage effectively, spearheaded many German attacks. The Panther's sloped frontal armour, 75mm long-barreled gun, and superior optics made it a dangerous opponent for American Sherman tanks and even the heavier tank destroyers like the M10 Wolverine and M18 Hellcat. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. American tank crews had developed tactics to deal with Panthers: flanking maneuvers to hit the thinner side armor, ambushes at close range, coordinated attacks with multiple vehicles engaging simultaneously, and calling in air support or artillery when possible. But these tactics required favorable terrain, good visibility, numerical superiority, or lucky positioning. In the dense forests and poor weather conditions of the Ardennes in winter, none of these advantages could be counted on. American tankers found themselves repeatedly outgunned by German armor, forced to maneuver desperately to get killing shots, while German Panthers could engage and destroy Allied vehicles from ranges where American guns were ineffective. It was in this context of tactical frustration that some American and British units began to seriously consider using captured German anti-tank weapons. The German 88mm gun, formerly designated as the 8.8 cm Flak 18, 36, or 37, depending on the model, had gained an almost legendary reputation among Allied soldiers. Originally designed as an anti-aircraft weapon, the 88mm had been pressed into anti-tank service during the North African campaign and had proven devastatingly effective. Its high-velocity armor-piercing rounds could penetrate virtually any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. German forces employed the 88mm in multiple roles, mounted on heavy tank destroyers like the Ferdinand and Jagd Panther, installed in fixed fortifications along the Atlantic Wall, and most commonly as a towed anti-tank and anti-aircraft gun deployed in defensive positions. As Allied forces advanced through France and into the Low Countries in late 1944, they captured hundreds of these weapons. Most were destroyed in place or simply bypassed as Allied units raced forward, but some forward-thinking officers began ordering their men to preserve captured 88mm guns they encountered, particularly those that were intact with ammunition nearby. The first documented use of a captured German 88mm gun by American forces against German armor appears to have occurred in late December 1944, during the desperate fighting around Bastogne. An American infantry company, part of the 101st Airborne Division defending the encircled town, had taken up positions near a small village on the southern approaches to Bastogne. During the German offensive's initial phase, a Wehrmacht artillery battery had been forced to abandon several pieces of equipment when American resistance proved stronger than expected. Among the abandoned equipment was an 88mm Flak 37 gun, complete with its wheeled carriage, optical sight, and approximately 40 rounds of armor-piercing and high-explosive ammunition stacked nearby in wooden crates. The American paratroopers initially planned to destroy the gun to prevent its recapture, but a lieutenant who had served briefly with an anti-tank unit before transferring to the airborne recognized the weapon's potential value. The defensive perimeter around Bastogne was under constant pressure from German armored attacks, and the paratroopers had limited anti-tank capability beyond bazookas and a few towed 57mm anti-tank guns, neither of which was particularly effective against frontal attacks by Panthers or the even heavier Tiger tanks that were reported in the area. The lieutenant convinced his company commander to let him try to make the captured gun operational. The first challenge was simply understanding how the weapon worked. None of the Americans had been trained on German artillery, and while the basic principles of operating a large gun were universal, the specific controls, sighting mechanisms, and loading procedures were unfamiliar. The German gun's controls were labelled in German, naturally, which posed problems for soldiers who spoke no German beyond a few crude phrases picked up from prisoners. But American soldiers have never been easily discouraged by technical challenges. Over the course of several hours, a small group of paratroopers, including the lieutenant, a sergeant who had worked as an auto mechanic in civilian life, and several privates with various mechanical aptitudes, systematically figured out how to operate the 88mm gun. They identified the elevation and traverse controls by trial and error, worked out how the breech mechanism opened and closed, figured out the loading sequence, and most critically, learned how to use the optical sight to aim the weapon. By nightfall on December 23rd, they had test-fired 3 rounds at a destroyed German half-track about 600 yards away, achieving 2 direct hits and gaining confidence in their ability to actually hit targets. The gun was positioned in a shallow depression at the edge of a tree line with a clear field of fire covering the main road approach from the south. The paratroopers camouflaged it with cut pine branches and positioned infantry with bazookas on the flanks to protect against any German troops who might try to assault the gun position. The test came on December 24th, Christmas Eve. A German armoured column, led by 3 Panther tanks followed by half-tracks carrying infantry, advanced up the road toward the American positions. The American 57mm anti-tank gun positioned several hundred yards to the left of the captured 88mm engaged first, hitting the lead Panther in the track and immobilizing it but not penetrating its armor. The German column stopped, and the Panthers began traversing their turrets to locate and engage the American gun. This was exactly the moment the lieutenant commanding the captured 88mm had been waiting for. The Panthers, stationary and presenting their frontal armor, were at a range of approximately 900 yards, far beyond the effective range of most American anti-tank weapons, but well within the 88mm gun's capability. The lieutenant, peering through the optical sight, centered the crosshairs on the second Panther in line. His crew, working with the nervous efficiency of men who had practiced their roles for only a few hours, loaded an armor-piercing round, closed the breech, and waited for the fire command. The lieutenant took a breath, confirmed his aim, and gave the order to fire. The 88mm gun roared, its report distinctive and much louder than the American weapons nearby. The armor-piercing round covered the 900 yards to its target in less than a second, striking the Panther just to the left of its gun mantlet. The penetration was catastrophic. The Panther's frontal armor, which could reliably defeat American 75mm and 76mm tank guns at that range, was simply overwhelmed by the 88mm round's kinetic energy. The shell punched through the armor, and the Panther exploded seconds later as its ammunition detonated, flames and black smoke pouring from every hatch. The German column immediately began to reverse, the remaining 2 Panthers backing down the road while their accompanying infantry scrambled off the half-tracks and dispersed into the woods. But the American crew manning the captured 88mm gun was already loading a second round. They had practiced this reload sequence repeatedly during their brief training period, and they executed it smoothly despite the adrenaline and chaos of actual combat. The gun fired again, this time targeting the trailing Panther as it attempted to reverse around a curve in the road. The round struck the Panther's frontal armor again, this time hitting the lower glacis plate. Another penetration, another catastrophic kill. The third Panther managed to escape, disappearing back down the road, trailing smoke from what appeared to be a partial hit or near miss. The American paratroopers in the captured gun position sat in stunned silence for a moment, hardly believing what they had just accomplished. They had destroyed 2 Panther tanks, vehicles that had been terrorizing Allied armor for months, in less than 90 seconds, using a weapon that none of them had even seen before 3 days earlier. The company commander, observing from a nearby position, immediately radioed battalion headquarters with a report of the engagement. His message noted that a captured German 88mm gun had proven highly effective against German armor, and recommended that other units attempt to preserve and employ similar captured weapons where feasible. This recommendation made its way up the chain of command, reaching division and corps levels within 24 hours. The success at Bastogne was not an isolated incident. Throughout the Ardennes battle, other American units were independently discovering the value of captured German heavy weapons. A tank destroyer battalion attached to the 3rd Armoured Division captured an intact 88mm gun near Houffalize in early January 1945. The battalion commander, a pragmatic officer who cared more about results than regulations, ordered his men to bring the gun into their defensive perimeter and put it to use. Over the next week, that single captured 88mm gun was credited with destroying 4 Panthers, 2 Stooge 3 assault guns, and at least 3 lighter German armoured vehicles. The gun's crew, all volunteers from the tank destroyer battalion who learned to operate the weapon through trial and error, became something of celebrities within their unit. Other soldiers would visit their position to see the famous captured gun and hear stories about its kills. The Tank Destroyer Battalion's after-action report explicitly stated that the captured 88mm had been more effective during that week of fighting than any of the battalion's own M10 Wolverine tank destroyers, a frank admission that raised eyebrows at higher headquarters but could not be ignored given the verified kill records. British forces fighting in the northern sector of the Bulge were making similar discoveries. A unit of the British 6th Airborne Division captured an 88mm gun position that had been hastily abandoned by retreating German forces near Dinant. British anti-tank crews, who were familiar with their own excellent 17-pounder anti-tank gun, were nonetheless impressed by the 88mm performance. They put the captured gun to immediate use and found it devastatingly effective against German armour attempting to retreat across the Meuse River. What made the 88mm gun so effective was not any single extraordinary feature, but rather a combination of characteristics that added up to a superior anti-tank weapon. First, the gun's ballistic performance was exceptional. The 88mm caliber, firing a 10.2 kg armor-piercing projectile at a muzzle velocity of approximately 800 meters per second, produced tremendous kinetic energy at the target. This energy allowed the gun to penetrate armor that could defeat smaller caliber weapons. At 1,000 yards, the 88mm could reliably penetrate approximately 165 mm of rolled homogeneous armor, more than enough to defeat any Allied tank frontally, and sufficient to penetrate even the Panther's frontal armor at reasonable combat ranges. Second, the gun's optical sight was of excellent quality. German optics had long been recognized as among the finest in the world, and the 88mm gun's sighting system allowed for accurate engagement of targets at extreme ranges. American tank gunners, accustomed to the adequate but not exceptional optics on their own vehicles, found the 88mm sight revelation. They could clearly identify and precisely aim at targets at distances where American sights showed only blurry outlines. Third, the gun's mount, while heavy and cumbersome to move, provided a stable firing platform. The weapon's recoil mechanism was well engineered, allowing for relatively quick follow-up shots. The gun's traverse and elevation controls were smooth and precise, making it possible to track moving targets and make fine adjustments to aim. Finally, and perhaps most importantly from a psychological perspective, the 88mm gun gave American and British crews confidence that they could actually destroy German heavy armor. Tank crews who had spent months feeling outgunned by Panthers and Tigers suddenly had access to a weapon that put them on equal or better terms. This confidence translated into better battlefield performance. Crews manning captured 88mm guns were more likely to stand their ground when facing German armor because they knew their weapon could do the job. By mid-January 1945, as the Battle of the Bulge ground to its conclusion and Allied forces prepared to resume offensive operations into Germany, the use of captured German 88mm guns had become common enough that it attracted official attention. Intelligence officers began compiling reports on how many such guns had been captured, how many were being actively employed by Allied units, and what their combat effectiveness had been. Ordnance officers began studying the feasibility of providing Allied crews with proper training on captured German weapons and ensuring adequate supplies of captured ammunition were made available to units employing these guns. The logistical implications were significant. Every 88mm gun that Allied forces wanted to keep in service required ammunition, and while large stocks of German 88mm ammunition had been captured, they were finite. Ordnance units had to establish procedures for collecting captured ammunition, transporting it forward to units with captured guns, and keeping track of inventory. This was not the streamlined logistics system that supported American weapons, but it was workable, at least in the short term. The breakthrough moment came not through official channels or formal doctrine, but through the quiet determination of frontline soldiers who refused to be outgunned by an enemy they were supposed to be defeating. By February 1945, as Allied forces crossed the Ruhr River and prepared for the final push into the German heartland, the improvised use of captured 88mm guns had evolved from desperate expedient into deliberate tactical doctrine. What had begun as scattered individual initiatives by creative junior officers had become a coordinated effort involving hundreds of guns and thousands of Allied soldiers who had taught themselves to operate weapons their own nations had never trained them to use. The scale of this transformation was remarkable. Intelligence estimates from late February 1945 suggested that Allied forces in the Western European theatre were actively employing approximately 300 captured German 88mm guns in frontline service. This figure did not include guns held in reserve, those awaiting ammunition resupply, or those captured but not yet deployed. The actual number of 88mm guns in some form of Allied custody was probably closer to 600 or 700. These weapons had become integral to Allied anti-tank defences, supplementing and in some cases replacing American and British weapons that had proven inadequate against German heavy armour. The effectiveness of these captured guns was documented in after-action reports that painted a picture of systematic dominance. During the 3-week period from February 15th to March 7th, 1945, as Allied forces fought through the Rhineland and approached the Rhine River itself, captured 88mm guns in American hands were credited with the destruction of at least 150 Panthers, along with dozens of other German armoured vehicles including Tigers, tank destroyers, and assault guns. British forces using captured 88mm guns added another 75 confirmed German armour kills during the same period. These were not propaganda figures inflated for morale purposes. They were carefully verified combat assessments based on post-battle surveys of destroyed vehicles, correlation with German unit losses, and physical inspection of engagement sites. The 150 Panthers destroyed by captured 88mm guns represented a significant percentage of all Panther losses on the Western Front during that period. German armoured forces, already reeling from fuel shortages, crew losses, and mechanical breakdowns, were now being systematically destroyed by their own weapons turned against them. The irony was not lost on German soldiers who found themselves under fire from 88mm guns manned by American or British crews. Interrogation reports from German prisoners captured in March 1945 contain numerous references to the psychological impact of this role reversal. German tankers described the distinctive sound of 88mm guns firing and the instinctive dread that sound provoked, a dread that was not diminished by the realization that the guns were now being operated by the enemy. One captured Panther commander told his interrogators that his greatest fear was not American Shermans, which his crew had learned to handle, but American-operated 88mm guns, which his Panther could not reliably defeat. The tactical implications extended beyond simple kill ratios. The presence of captured 88mm guns in Allied hands fundamentally altered German tactical calculations. German armoured units could no longer assume that they enjoyed firepower superiority at long ranges. They could no longer rely on their frontal armour to protect them during advances. Every engagement now carried the risk that Allied forces would have access to weapons capable of destroying Panthers and Tigers at distances where German return fire might be ineffective. This uncertainty forced German commanders to be more cautious, to husband their dwindling armoured reserves, and to avoid the kind of aggressive armoured counterattacks that had been a hallmark of German defensive doctrine earlier in the war. The human stories behind these statistics were profound. Consider the crew of a captured 88mm gun positioned near Goch in the Rhineland during the first week of March 1945. The gun crew consisted of 6 American soldiers, none of whom had been trained as artillerymen. The gun commander was a former infantryman who had been wounded at Normandy and reassigned to a headquarters unit during his recovery. The gunner was a tank driver whose Sherman had been destroyed at the Battle of the Bulge. The loaders included a military policeman, a truck driver, and 2 riflemen from a depleted infantry company. They had been formed into an improvised gun crew when their unit captured the 88mm gun in late February, and they had taught themselves to operate it using a combination of trial and error, advice from more experienced crews, and study of captured German training manuals that had been hastily translated by an intelligence officer who spoke schoolboy German. Over the course of 9 days, this improvised crew destroyed 11 German armoured vehicles, 7 Panthers, 3 Stug 3 assault guns, and 1 Tiger tank. Each kill represented not just mechanical destruction but a small human drama. The Tiger tank engagement was particularly memorable. The Tiger had appeared on a ridgeline approximately 1,400 yards from the American position, its massive profile immediately identifiable even in the morning mist. The American gun commander, watching through binoculars, felt his stomach tighten. He had seen what Tigers could do. He had watched one destroy 3 Shermans in less than 2 minutes during the Ardennes battle. But now he had an 88mm gun, and the Tiger's armour, while thick, was not invulnerable to its own weapon. The engagement lasted less than 30 seconds from first sighting to impact. The American gunner, a 22-year-old from Ohio, who had driven milk trucks before the war, tracked the Tiger through his sight as it traversed its turret, apparently searching for targets. The gun commander gave the range estimate, the loader confirmed the round was seated, and the gunner fired. The first round missed, passing just over the Tiger's turret. The loader was already slamming a second round into the breech. The gunner made a minute adjustment to his aim, compensating for the slight error in his range estimation. The second round hit the Tiger on its frontal armour, just below the gun mantlet. At 1,400 yards, the 88mm round still carried sufficient energy to penetrate. The Tiger shuddered, smoke began pouring from its engine deck, and moments later the crew bailed out, running from their stricken vehicle. The American gun crew erupted in cheers. They had just destroyed a Tiger tank, one of the most feared weapons in the German arsenal, using a weapon that had been built by their enemy. The psychological reversal was complete. They were no longer the undergunned underdogs. They were now the ones with superior firepower. That night, the gun commander wrote a letter home to his wife in Pennsylvania. The letter, preserved in his family's papers and later donated to a military archive, captures the emotional complexity of that moment. He wrote about the strange feeling of using a German weapon, about the satisfaction of turning the enemy's strength against them, but also about the sobering reality that he was using this weapon to kill other human beings, German soldiers who were themselves probably conscripts, with families waiting for them at home. War had made him into someone he had never imagined becoming, an artilleryman operating an enemy weapon, destroying enemy vehicles with methodical efficiency, and yet still troubled by the humanity of those he was fighting against. The 3-week period of intensive combat that saw captured 88mm guns destroy 150 Panthers also revealed important lessons about adaptability and innovation in warfare. The American military of 1945 was not the same military that had landed in North Africa in 1942, or even the one that had landed in Normandy in 1944. It had learned, adapted, and evolved. The willingness to use captured enemy weapons represented a departure from earlier doctrine, but it was a departure born of practical necessity and battlefield realism. American and British soldiers had recognized that their own anti-tank weapons, while adequate in many situations, were insufficient against the best German armor. Rather than simply accepting this disadvantage and relying on superior numbers or air support to compensate, they had seized the opportunity to arm themselves with weapons that could compete on equal terms. This adaptability extended to every level of military organization. Junior officers and non-commissioned officers, the men actually leading troops in combat, had taken the initiative to preserve and deploy captured weapons without waiting for permission from higher headquarters. When higher headquarters caught up and realized what was happening, they had the wisdom to support these initiatives rather than suppress them as unauthorized deviations from standard procedure. Logistics officers worked out how to supply captured guns with ammunition. Intelligence officers translated German technical manuals. Training officers developed crash courses in German weapon operation. The entire system adapted to support an innovation that had emerged from the bottom up, rather than being imposed from the top down. The German response to this development was revealing. German intelligence officers, analyzing reports from frontline units about American-operated 88mm guns, initially refused to believe what they were hearing. The idea that American soldiers, who German propaganda had consistently portrayed as mechanically incompetent and over-reliant on technology, could master sophisticated German weapons seemed implausible. But as evidence accumulated, reports from multiple units, photographs of captured German guns in American positions, and interrogations of American prisoners who confirmed the practice, German military intelligence was forced to accept reality. Some German officers saw this as further evidence of Allied material superiority. The Americans had so much captured equipment that they could afford to use it operationally. Others saw it as a sign of desperation, proof that American weapons were inferior and that American forces were reduced to scavenging German equipment. The truth, of course, was more nuanced. American forces were using captured weapons not because they were desperate, but because they were pragmatic. They recognized superior equipment when they encountered it, and they were willing to use it regardless of its origin. This pragmatism was itself a form of superiority, a flexibility that German military culture, with its emphasis on doctrinal purity and adherence to established procedures, often lacked. By March 1945, as Allied forces reached and began crossing the Rhine River, the tactical landscape had shifted decisively. German armoured forces, once the spearhead of German offensive power and the backbone of German defensive strategy, were shadows of their former strength. Fuel shortages had immobilized many units. Crew losses had forced the Germans to man their remaining tanks with inadequately trained replacements. Mechanical breakdowns, always a problem with Germany's over-engineered and under-maintained vehicles, had become epidemic. And now, even when German armour did manage to engage Allied forces, they faced the real possibility of being destroyed by their own weapons operated by enemy crews who had learned to use them with deadly efficiency. The 150 Panthers destroyed by captured 88mm guns in 3 weeks represented tanks that Germany could not replace. By early 1945, German tank production had collapsed. Allied bombing had disrupted manufacturing, destroyed factories, and severed supply chains. The few tanks that German industry still managed to produce often lacked critical components or were built with substitute materials that compromised their performance. Germany had bet its military strategy on the superiority of its armoured forces, and that bet had failed, not primarily because German tanks were technically inferior. They were often superior in many respects, but because Germany could not sustain armoured warfare. The fuel was gone, the replacement crews were undertrained, the spare parts were unavailable, and now even the psychological advantage of superior firepower had been neutralized by Allied soldiers using captured German weapons. The human cost of these 3 weeks of intensive combat extended far beyond the numbers of tanks destroyed. Each destroyed Panther represented a crew of 5 men, a commander, a gunner, a loader, a radio operator, and a driver. 150 Panthers meant 750 German tankers killed, wounded, or captured. Many Panthers, when hit by 88mm rounds, did not burn immediately, giving their crews a chance to bail out. But many did burn, and catastrophic ammunition explosions were common when armor was penetrated. German tank crewmen in early 1945 knew that every mission might be their last, that their vehicles were targets for weapons that could destroy them at ranges where they could not effectively fight back, and that escape from a burning tank was never guaranteed. American and British crews operating captured 88mm guns also faced dangers. These guns, while powerful, were not invulnerable. They were large, relatively immobile once emplaced, and conspicuous. German artillery and mortar fire targeted suspected gun positions. German infantry attempted to infiltrate and destroy captured guns. Counter-battery fire from German tanks that spotted the muzzle flash of an 88mm gun could be devastating. Operating a captured gun also carried unique risks. Ammunition that had been stored improperly or damaged during capture might misfire or fail to fire at all. Maintenance and repair of captured weapons required improvisation since proper spare parts were rarely available, and there was always the risk of friendly fire, of being targeted by Allied aircraft or artillery that saw a German-looking gun position and assumed it was hostile. Yet soldiers continued to volunteer for these crews because the 88mm gun gave them something they desperately wanted: the ability to fight German armor on equal terms. The psychological transformation this represented cannot be overstated. For years, Allied soldiers had fought with the knowledge that enemy tanks might be superior to their own. They had developed courage and tactics to compensate, but the underlying anxiety remained. Now, manning a captured 88mm gun, they felt that anxiety lift. They were no longer outgunned. They had become the predators rather than the prey. As the war in Europe entered its final weeks in April 1945, the role of captured 88mm guns began to diminish, not because they had become less effective, but because German resistance was collapsing so rapidly that organized armored combat became increasingly rare. German armored units that had managed to survive the Rhineland battles were now fragmented, immobilized by fuel shortages, or in full retreat toward the shrinking perimeter of Reich territory. Allied forces were advancing so quickly that logistics struggled to keep pace, and supplying captured guns with German ammunition became a lower priority than moving fuel and supplies forward for the pursuit. Many captured 88mm guns were simply left behind as Allied units raced eastward, their crews returning to their original units or being reassigned to new tasks. Some guns were turned over to newly liberated populations, given to French, Belgian, or Dutch forces who were establishing their own defense forces as their countries emerged from occupation. A few captured guns were carefully preserved and shipped back to the United States or Britain for detailed technical evaluation, but the vast majority were eventually abandoned, scrapped, or simply forgotten in the chaos of the war's final collapse. The soldiers who had operated these guns, however, never forgot the experience. Veterans interviewed decades after the war consistently mentioned the captured 88mm guns as among the most effective weapons they had used. They spoke of the confidence those guns had given them, the satisfaction of turning German engineering against its creators, and the lives they believed those guns had saved by destroying German armor before it could destroy Allied vehicles. They also reflected on the broader meaning of what they had done. Using enemy weapons was not unprecedented in military history. Soldiers have always scavenged useful equipment from defeated foes, but the scale and systematic nature of 88mm gun employment by Allied forces in early 1945 was unusual. It represented a kind of practical democracy in warfare, a recognition that good ideas and good equipment should be used regardless of their origin. The story of Allied tankers and soldiers using captured German 88mm guns to destroy 150 Panthers in 3 weeks is ultimately a story about human adaptability in the face of existential challenges. These men, most of them civilians in uniform who had never imagined they would become warriors, had confronted a tactical problem that threatened their survival. Their own weapons were insufficient. The enemy had superior firepower. Traditional doctrine offered no solution. So they improvised. They learned to operate foreign weapons, developed new tactics, overcame logistical obstacles, and ultimately turned their enemy's strength into a weakness. This is what soldiers have always done in every war throughout history. They adapt, they innovate, they refuse to accept defeat, and they find ways to survive and win even when circumstances seem impossible. The young lieutenant who convinced his company commander to preserve that first captured 88mm gun near Bastogne probably never imagined that his decision would be replicated hundreds of times across the Western Front. The tank destroyer crew that abandoned their own vehicle to man a captured German gun probably never thought they were starting a trend that would destroy over 100 German tanks. They were simply trying to survive, to complete their missions, to protect their fellow soldiers, and to contribute to the defeat of an enemy they had travelled thousands of miles to fight. In doing so, they wrote a small but significant chapter in the history of the Second World War, a chapter about resourcefulness, courage, and the ultimate triumph of adaptability over rigid doctrine. The war would end in May 1945 with Germany's unconditional surrender. The captured 88mm guns would be forgotten by most of history, footnotes in after-action reports and memories in the minds of aging veterans. But for 3 crucial weeks in the late winter and early spring of 1945, those guns had mattered enormously. They had given Allied soldiers the firepower they needed to defeat German armour. They had saved lives by destroying enemy vehicles before those vehicles could destroy Allied tanks. They had demonstrated that victory in modern war requires not just industrial capacity or numerical superiority, but also the flexibility to recognize and employ good equipment, regardless of its source. And they had proven once again that the true strength of democratic armies lies not in their obedience to rigid doctrine, but in their ability to empower individual soldiers and junior leaders to make decisions, take initiative, and adapt to circumstances that no planner could have anticipated. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.